Welcome back to Martins and More. My name's Maury Rutch.
And I'm Spoon Phillips.
This episode of Martins and More is brought to you by the Martin D45 Fire and Ice. The Fire and Ice is a very unique instrument designed by renowned artist Harvey Leach, featuring an Engelmann spruce top with heavy bear claw and gorgeous Madagascar rosewood back and sides. For more information on the D45 Fire and Ice, please contact Maury's Music today. We have a lot to talk about today. What's going on, Spoon?
Well, I'm sitting here on what's actually an overcast, rainy spring day, and I'm glad to have some company in the form of my pal Maury. How's the weather out there in Pennsylvania?
It is equally cloudy and crappy, and nothing better to do today than sit in the podcast studio with one of my best buds. I think you meant to say it's a podcast day, not an overcast day.
Bunch! Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. And that is our least favorite weather friends, cloudy and crappy. Here they are now.
You know, this is the first episode for season 3, and if we're going to make a change, the time is now. Would you consider calling this cloudy and crappy?
I think we have to shelve that idea. And I think we may just need to stick with Martins and More.
All right, Cloudy, I'll follow your lead. You're the one that knows everything about this stuff. So, anywho, I have a question for you. What do Buzz Aldrin, Buzz Lightyear, and Buzz Bunny have in common? I couldn't think of a third Buzz.
That's a very, very good question. I can't think of a third Buzz either. But all three of them have a buzz. And we have recently heard from a loyal listener of Martins and More, our friend William C., who informed us that he has a reimagined 00028 that he loves a lot, but it has some buzzing going on when he plays it. And he wanted to ask Maury, and I'm going to tag along, of what might be causing the buzzing and what are his options in terms of doing something about it to make it not buzz.
Well, that's a great topic, and it's probably not the first time we've heard this brought up in conversation. It is a very good segue before I get into the meat and bones of this whole podcast to remind you that this season we almost promised to guarantee to get our good friend John Hall on the airwaves from Blues Creek Guitars. This would be something right up his alley, but I'm going to tell you some of the things I've learned from guys like him, guys like Tim Teal, some really, really knowledgeable people who know how to build guitars, fix guitars, and alleviate buzzes. There is more than one thing that could be wrong when you hear somebody complain about a buzz. It could be one of more than a few different issues or a combination of some of them. But before we dive into what could cause buzzing, let me ask you, can you tell from his comment, did he specifically mean a buzz, or could it have been a rattle or a noise? There are a lot of things in the family of unwanted sounds, when it comes to a buzzing sound.
Yes, that's a great question. I've often said that when it comes to music, musical instruments, and the phenomena of sounds of all kinds, what one person says to refer to a sound or a kind of sound or a quality of sound may translate completely differently in somebody else's brain. And a very good example is when people are talking about the tone of a guitar, saying a guitar sounds warm or a guitar sounds bright. Those kind of expressions and words can mean different things to different people. And buzz is certainly one of those words. So for right now, I'm going to assume he's talking about what I would call a buzz that basically can be sound like the word buzz with a Z at the end, and sometimes I refer to it as when I'm playing a guitar that's on certain strings or in certain positions, and it sounds a little bit like a sitar kind of buzz. So what do you think is, let's say somebody says buzz and you assume they're talking about a buzz as opposed to a rattle. What would you say is the first thing you think of and look for? What you think is the most common or the number one suspect when somebody says, I'm playing my guitar and it buzzes?
Probably low action. And when I say this, that's the first thing I think of, but the first two or three things I think of are equally as popular. So that's not to say I always assume it's going to be low action, but that's the first thing I really do think of, only because we see so many guitarists come in here to Maury's Music from either Martin or Blue Ridge, and whether they're coming from a perfectly done factory setup and driven from the Martin factory in my own vehicle back here, or from being manufactured in China with the Blue Ridge guitars being shipped and inspected in San Francisco and then shipped all the way across the country to us. The times I've heard guitars that have a buzz, that's the very first thing I check for. So, hearing a story long distance about someone's complaining to you about their issue, it's certainly not easy to diagnose without seeing it, but that would be my first question back to that person. If the height of the strings, and that's what the action is, the height of the strings from the top of the 12th fret to the bottom of the string, if that gets too low and you're not careful with the way you're playing with your technique, you can certainly get a buzz because the strings don't have enough room to get out of their own way. If you're going to strum a chord, the vibration you set in motion to each string needs a little bit of room to move up and down and oscillate, for a better term. So low action would be my first guess. And it's not to say that that's always the culprit, but oftentimes that's really what I look for first.
Well, I'm glad you went into a little more detail about what action is. People hear about that a lot. And of course, you look up the word action in the dictionary. If you can even find a definition that refers to the height of a guitar string or the string of a fretted instrument above the fret, it's going to be way down the line. So people hear about a guitar having great action, and a lot of times a lot of people have no idea what that means. By coincidence that you bring this up, I had received an email from a person named Kanarat, I hope I'm pronouncing that, from Thailand, who wanted to know about string height and Martin action. So the Martin factory considers the action specifications to fall between two measurements. And when we're talking about a low E string, and let's say we're going to talk about a dreadnought with medium strings. Low E string is supposed to be between two measurements. These are metric. This is 2 and 2.38 millimeters is minimum. It has to be at least 2.38 millimeters above the fret, the bottom of the string, or at its most 2.78 millimeters. And for those of you who are not that familiar with the metric system, who live in the United States or Liberia or the People's Republic of Myanmar, which is the only three countries that don't use metric system, that measurement means that the bass E string should be 3/32 minimum above the fret at the 12th fret, and the bass E string should be at the most 7/64 maximum. The treble string should be 1/16 minimum, 5/64 maximum. And so that translates to minimum 1.59 millimeter, maximum 1.98 millimeter. And again, I'm talking about medium gauge strings. Light gauge strings, well, Maury, let me ask you, where do you set a dreadnought with medium strings that's come from the factory that might have needed a little adjustment?
Well, there's a little bit of a two-pronged answer there, because if you're getting a Blue Ridge guitar, those actually arrive with lights. So I'll answer this the same way in any case, because the height of the string from the top of the 12th fret to the bottom of the string, when we're talking about finding that tolerance and arriving inside that window of acceptable range for Martin, regardless of whether it's lights, extra lights, or mediums, that's really the target. You want to be 3/32 at the bass E and 2/32 at the treble E. And you walk into the Martin factory and you'll hear people talk all the time, 3 and 2, 3 and 2. That's the shortcut or the shorthand version of it. So that's the starting point. And I want to definitely be careful to say starting point, because I think we all know somebody who could play a guitar that's set up nice and low, play it very carefully, and have a great time with it, because it's not hard to play. They're not fighting it. There's no reason to put it higher, because they're not going to make it buzz, because their technique and their acceptance of a little bit of a buzz. So if you hand some delicate fingerstyle player, for example, a Martin guitar with the action at 3 on the bass side, and they can play it very comfortably, does that mean that's where everyone should have it set? Absolutely not, because we all know someone else who you hand them the guitar and they're going to be the bull in the china closet and have a very heavy attack. They're going to have a technique that's different from the first person. And it's important to say this early in this show. We're not picking on anybody if it starts to sound like we're talking about, hey, you over there, you have perfect technique. This guy on this side of the room, your technique stinks. That's not what we're saying. But your technique will dictate how much you can actually make the guitar more or less comfortable. So my technique, the way I play, if I want to play my own guitar, is heavy-handed, and I don't like a lot of buzz. You find someone else who has a heavy hand that doesn't mind buzz, you can set it up differently. You find somebody with really good technique that can play carefully without feeling like they're being forced to play carefully. It's all very variable, but to start the program the right way, I'll agree and tell you, Spoon, it is 3 and 2, and that's where I would set it up if we got a guitar in here from one of the factories, whether it's Martin or not. If it came in a little bit too high or a little bit too low, or was built perfectly but ended up moving a little bit in the 10 or 15 days since the guitar was built, that's where I would send it back to. However, and I'm not trying to make this answer longer than it should be, if it comes in and it's a little bit too high, I'll let you in on a little secret. I might leave it alone just because we might sell that guitar in 2 months to somebody who asks for action that's a little bit higher. So I know that I have to make an adjustment, but there are times that I'll actually wait until the guitar does sell so I don't adjust it twice.
Well, that's fascinating. It didn't even occur to me that of course makes perfect sense that you may have customers who let you know in advance that I like higher action. That's certainly me. I think we're both in kind of the same boat. You mentioned the guy over here who has great technique and perfect technique, and the guy over here whose technique stinks. I think if listeners go to YouTube and see the video where Maury and I did our own sort of Martin versus Martin when I was visiting at Coaldale to see the NAMM guitars, and you'll see that Maury has beautiful technique and my technique stinks. It's, I'm totally self-taught, and it's just the way I play. So and one of the things I need is high action. I've never purchased a Martin. That's not entirely true. I think the Lawrence Juber models that I have purchased have worked for me very well. But every time I've gotten a Martin, I had to have the action adjusted because they just set them up far too low for me. And I play too hard, I press too hard, and I waggle the strings around too hard. And I definitely need higher action because I play hard enough that the strings are I don't know, I guess vibrating around so much that they keep contacting the frets. So I've always gone for higher action, though still within spec, but typically speaking. So action is one reason. If the action's low in combination with how you play, now if the action's too low, no matter how good you're going to be at playing gently, you're going to end up having some fret buzz from the strings getting on the frets. As my old man used to say, his thing was the game of golf, and he was as into that as I am acoustic guitars. And he would tell anybody, and he was very good at the game, that you hit every club the exact same way. With as little tension as possible. You want to be nice and relaxed and smooth, and you let the club do the work. That's why there's different club lengths. And so you hit your driver the same way you hit your pitching wedge if you're doing it right. And the same thing with playing guitar. I envy people who can play effortlessly, completely relaxed. They don't actually hit the strings very hard at all, and they find very quickly where that guitar wants to be played, where it's at its most resonant and sounds the most beautiful. I play very emotionally. Maury knows what I'm talking about. He does that to a certain extent as well. And so I can love playing delicate old vintage guitars or some new guitars with very low action, but I feel constrained that I can't I got to be me, and those kind of guitars. I can't be me, but so that's one thing. If as Maury pointed out, some people like to be careful while they play and play with low comfortable action and adjust their playing to avoid buzzing. That's different than the action being genuinely too low. And do you find, Maury, that is it usually if the action's too low, it's every string, or is it times where one string might have its action different than the others?
Usually it's every string, but that said, the treble strings could be a little bit more problematic than others. But normally, when I find this is the problem, the treble E and the B might buzz a little bit more than the others, but the other ones buzz as well. So, and one thing I wanted to add to the last thing you said, especially for anybody listening, and if you might not have listened very closely at the beginning, the technique thing. It's not like your technique is bad or you're picking on yourself the way you said that. You can play carefully, but you just don't want to. And there are some people that can't play carefully. And if you're just beginning your journey learning how to play guitar, you might be in that camp with you're not experienced enough yet. You're just a beginner. You don't know yet. But even people who do know that have been playing guitar, 30 years longer than us, might have technique that they just want to be reckless because it's fun. And it's not to say you can't play carefully. You just don't get enjoyment out of that. So I've often set up guitars for customers, and I'll tell you the truth. I'll be like, oh, I wish I could play this guitar. This feels so comfortable. And you might say, well, why don't you just set up your own guitar that way? You have your guitars here and you work in the store. Well, because I won't remember that feeling when I'm playing at a gig, and I just want to let loose. So it's that whole thing where we can go to Martin Fest, you and I, and play the most comfortable guitars and pass them around and give them to someone else and back to the owner and be like, yeah, that ain't going to work for me. It's so fun for a minute. And like you said, you might pick a really small, quiet passage to play on that to make it sound right. But it's the comfort that you're looking for in your own thing. But I hope I didn't go too long-winded there.
No, and well, we're both really good at that. But I always appreciate hearing the comments and emails of people who like the fact we go into details like this. But I have played people's guitars where I was like, I can't believe he plays the thing. It buzzes so badly. But then I'll see him playing it, like at a Martin Fest, the hour later or whatever, and it's not buzzing at all. It's because I put a lot of elbow grease into my playing. And I have to remember to, ease off when it comes to and that's particularly a lot of vintage Martins are set up with very low action these days, sometimes with very little saddle left because they're trying to avoid a neck reset, and you just have to, you have to adjust to the guitar. And so unlike a golf club, you don't play every guitar the same way. But if you relax and not play so hard, I think a lot of people will be surprised as how much sound comes out and how little buzzing. And also, I'll just say, like you said, some people don't mind the buzzing. Just like they don't mind the wick, wick, wick sound of the fingers sliding on the strings. And other people do mind that and try very hard not to, slide their fingers on the strings. It's all relative. So that's one long reason and a main reason why you'll get buzzing from playing a guitar. And the reason I asked about particular strings is oftentimes only one string's buzzing. Somebody say, oh, it's just my bottom E string, or it's my G string, but it's only when I'm playing in the first 4 frets. So I put a capo on, it goes away. So those are symptoms of different causes of buzzing. So other than the overall action being lower, what's another more common reason for buzz?
Well, you just made me think of it when you said that. In that specific instance, it could be the nut. If you recognize the saddle is going to be the radius of the neck, so for Martin guitars, most of them are going to be a 16-inch radius. And if you look down, you put your table on, put your table on your guitar and say, I told you to do it. No, you put your guitar on a table, and look down, stand where if you basically lay your neck down like train tracks, the saddle and the neck have a radius of 16 inches. It's not dead flat. So typically, it would be very rare that somebody modified the top of the saddle to lose that perfect 16-inch radius. So the height of the saddle from E to E is probably going to remain consistent if you don't deliberately try and mess something up yourself. But the nut slots could wear over time, a little bit unevenly. So if you every time you tune your guitar and you take your bass E string tuner and you tune up from D to D sharp to E, whether you know it or not, you're taking that string and it's acting like a saw, and it's just going back and forth and over, billions of songs, you're making the nut slots a little bit low, and maybe you're doing it more on the bass E string than you do on the B, and vice versa. You could have a situation where it only buzzes on one string behind, frets 1 through 4. Using a capo goes somewhere else. The action at the nut has to be in spec for Martin. I don't have those figures in my head, but there's ways to measure it. So that's the short answer there. Is it could be the situation where 5 of the strings have a correct in spec action going through the nut, but one of them is low, and that can cause a buzz. That would probably cause a buzz more than on a few frets, but that's another symptom, or I should say another reason for buzzing.
I'm glad you brought that up. So now we're pinging and ponging off each other. When it comes to the nut, Maury pointed out how those strings will ultimately start to wear down that nut slot, and you can get buzzing not just because they're out of spec, but because they're not smooth. And so I know people will take graphite, literally like pencil lead, or very, very, I don't know. Let me ask you, when somebody's got like snags in their nut slots, what do you use to smooth those out?
Just nut files. It doesn't happen that often here, but if something does get bound a little bit or a little bit restrictive, just refiling them a little bit at the proper angle with the proper file. As you could imagine, you're going to need a really big file where the bass E sits and a very skinny one where the treble E sits. So we have it's more than 6 files, but I have a big container of nut files that I bought years and years ago. And I won't necessarily put pencil lead or any kind of sometimes they call it sauce. What I'll just do is clean it out by making a couple extra passes with the right tool. But you make a good point too. Sometimes that's not enough, and people don't want to add some kind of ingredient in there to make it even less friction. And pencil lead still ends up being something I would go to if I had to.
Yeah, and for not everybody has a set of nut files. So for people who are willing to work on their own guitars at the risk of voiding their warranty, graphite is a safe thing to use in the nut slots if you feel like something's snagging. That's also the case if you have a string. This often happens with E's and B strings, the unwound strings. If they seem to break abnormally quickly or break while you're tightening them up abnormally often, that's often because you have a snag in that. And that's especially true of bone. Hard material. Bone is a porous material. If you really looked at it under it greatly magnified, it's got a bunch of tiny little pores in it, and so bone can sometimes get snags in that. I'm going to take this moment to bring up something that maybe we'll add in a future myths about acoustic guitars program in the future, but I'm going to say it right now because I recently heard somebody whose local guitar tech guy, who's a very popular guitar tech guy with lots of guitars and lots of clients and knows lots of stuff, told this guy that Martins that come with light gauge strings and Martins that come with medium gauge strings have different nuts, and that the nut slots are actually cut for light gauge strings or cut for medium strings, and advise them not to put light gauge strings on their dreadnought or medium gauge strings on their double O, triple O. And I would just like to say for the record that that's absolute hooey. It's not true at all.
Hey, watch your language.
I beg your pardon. I should have said phooey. But yes, that's phooey. And Martin does not have different nut slots for light gauge strings or medium gauge strings. They use the same nut slots for both. And though that doesn't mean over time you using the same string isn't going to wear away your nut slots. And so it may make a difference where you change your string gauge from a 13 to a 12 or a 13 to 11 or 10. Then maybe you might run into you know, it mattering. But in terms of Martin factory, they don't have special nut slots for light gauge or medium gauge strings. So you heard it here first, folks. Um, so we've been talking about the nut and the saddle, and you were implying that something might have happened to the saddle to put it out of spec. So, so you're basically saying that people will adjust their own saddles to change their own string height. Is that what's going on?
Oh yeah, and you'll hear it from me that the correct way to do it is to take the saddle out of the guitar and sand the bottom of the saddle against a piece of sandpaper on something perfectly flat. Do it properly and slowly so you maintain that it's perfectly perpendicular. And if you do that incorrectly, you can have a saddle slot that's no longer perfectly flat. Or if you make the mistake of trying to sand the top of the saddle, unless you're extremely careful to keep that 16-inch radius perfectly true, you'll have issues there as well, let alone if you make a mistake on the very top with the intonation. And you guys might have heard the term compensated saddle, where the very top of the saddle, looking at it from the side, almost every string crosses the top of that saddle at a different distance. So not to get too technical into that stuff, but playing with the saddle and modifying it to make the action lower, unless you do it properly from the bottom, you're definitely inviting some issues. Even if you do it perfectly from the top, it's unnecessarily inconvenient at best case.
I remember the first time I heard compensated saddle, I thought, well, how much are they paying a saddle and what for? But they
Oh, God.
they're actually referring to the fact they're compensating for the fact that intonation changes as you play as you go up the neck, and that the B string requires a slightly different string length. When we're talking about string scale, when we're talking about long scale, short scale, we're talking about the distance of the playable frettable string from the nut to the saddle. And the B string was discovered relatively modern times, that shortening the B string's scale length a little bit, but more than the others. Like Maury said, they're not all exactly even, but you'll notice how the B string is noticeably different on the slot on the saddle than everything else, and they make the B string a little slow, so as you play up the neck, it stays in tune better when you fret it. And again, that's one thing. People like me who like high action, you just have to live with the fact that your strings are going to go slightly out of tune a little bit if you press them too hard, because you're bending the string so much downward to get to the frets. And so but to me, it's worth it to have less buzzing, to have a little intonation, adjustment. I'd rather have a little of intonation issue than a lot of buzzing. So we have nut and saddle reasons that could possibly be causing buzzing. And in this case, are we still talking about fret buzz in the sense that something's wrong with the nut or the saddle, so that particular string is contacting a fret, and so that's where we're getting that sitar buzz? Or is there buzzing that comes off that string at the nut or the saddle, or both of those possible?
Yes, and let me address some of them, and I think you might have meant to say that the scale length of the B string is elongated a little bit. I'm not sure.
Oh, I'm
if
sorry, it's the other way around.
longer.
That's right. Yeah, it's not shorter, it's long. Okay, yeah.
And I know you know that, but I want to make sure if somebody's listening that ran to their tape measure, don't go yet. Let me just make sure we heard that right. The B string actually crosses the back of the saddle compared to like the treble E, and if you look really carefully, the E string kind of cheats that way too. But it's another good topic. That might be its own podcast altogether. But yeah, when you're talking about the buzzing, the fact that the action is low at the nut and or the saddle, what I do mean is, yes, it's allowing the string to contact the frets too soon. It basically brings the action down at the north end and the south end of the string, but the frets are the guilty culprit in the middle. And that brings another point up that I should tie together that's not exactly that, but it's very similarly related. Fret buzz could also be a tall fret or a worn fret. So if you picture you bought a brand new Martin guitar from Maury's music. Thank you very much for your business. We're glad you did. You're going to see frets that are very clean, that are plecked from the factory, and the height of each fret, the crown, they're dressed properly, they're seated properly. There's nothing wrong with the frets. That's how it starts. Over time, if you're like Maury and you play your guitar too heavily and with too hard a hand, and this ties back to that, do you play carefully or do you play rambunctious? Whether or not you do or don't, in time you're going to need to look at the frets, because the string wire is stronger than the fret wire. Otherwise, you'd break strings every 2 songs. So the fact that you're playing strings and vibrating them, holding them down against the frets, eventually the frets are going to just start to wear and they'll get divots. So if by chance you have a very bad divot on the B string on the 4th fret, well, now when you press that down on certain chords and certain notes, you're pushing down, and the height of the string, how can I say this that's not going to take an hour? You're no longer seeing a completely uniform surface from frets 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on. 1, 2, 3 are nice and tall. 4 is low and has a pothole in it. 5, 6, and 7 are tall, or any kind of combination of that kind of thing. You're going to definitely see the opportunity over time for certain notes are going to buzz, because when you depress that string in the problem area of the neck, now you're no longer completely level. So it's a little bit above my pay grade to try and put that into 5 sentences and not either say the wrong thing or give the wrong impression. But if your frets are no longer completely perfect and they're beginning to get a groove, that can certainly lead to a fret buzz, and maybe somewhere where you wouldn't expect it. It's not necessarily obvious to a player who doesn't do setups or fret work, but once you start developing grooves in the frets, buzzes can happen. And let me just say that as a well-rounded short answer to a problem that really deserves a lot more time.
So we're going to take a brief break in the discussion for the new feature we have in Season 3, a version of 20 questions. So today, Maury is going to picture a Martin guitar in his mind, and I'm going to try to guess which one it is within 20 questions, or 3 guesses. I only get 3 guesses of what model it might be. So, Maury, I want you to picture a Martin guitar in your mind.
Well, first I have to take out of my mind that black and white cow cartoon that was in Homer Simpson's mind on some of our favorite episodes of The Simpsons. All right, let me just give myself a. Lori would say, okay, my mind is blank. I'm thinking of a guitar. It's either a Martin guitar or a Blue Ridge guitar. You have 20 questions. Go.
Well, then one of those questions has to be, is it a Martin guitar?
Yes.
Is it a Dreadnought?
Yes.
Is it currently being manufactured and sold today?
Yes.
Is it made of all solid tone woods?
Yes.
Does it have a spruce top?
No.
Is it the D15M?
Wow. You currently hold the record for the fastest game of 20 questions. That was 6 guesses.
6 questions, yes. That's pretty amazing. I have to say so myself. So the D15M, I think many of us love the fact that this is in the Martin lineup, made with solid mahogany back, sides, and top. It has a beautiful, warm, woody tone. They sell them with the Monel retro strings that are a nickel alloy string that they have decided to pair that warm, woody mahogany top sound with the strings that I think actually really enhance that mellowness. I do know that a lot of people actually change those strings out and use normal Foster Brown strings or 8020s on their 15s. But it's also a great value for an all solid wood guitar, and that's made in Nazareth, Pennsylvania. And I am always been a big fan of the 15 series. So a good choice to start off this feature, and I look forward to many more opportunities to see Maury try to get his own 20 questions in 6 questions or less.
Good luck. Once you start developing grooves in the frets, buzzes can happen. And let me just say that as a well-rounded short answer to a problem that really deserves a lot more time.
Well, yes, and when that happens, it's fixable. It's usually fixable. They call it dressing the frets. A technician who knows what he's doing, and if your Martin has a warranty because you're the original owner, you definitely want to seek out an official, Martin qualified technician to dress your frets. Sometimes some people will insist on, doing all the frets or nothing, which costs a little more money. Sometimes they have to actually replace a fret, and some people have their frets replaced over and over and over. Lawrence Juber, of course, can write it off as taxes, but just about every time he comes east, he drops a guitar off at the factory to be refretted because, of course, he's a hard player, and he definitely wears his frets out. And thankfully, he's going to be coming to New York soon because his daughter has a show coming up in New York City, and so hoping Lawrence will be coming to town soon.
Cool.
So I would not be surprised if he doesn't find time to go to the factory and drop off a guitar for a refret. But for the most part, I live with that. I've got divots in all my guitars have fret wear, and my 1980s OOC 16 has a lot of that, and I just have to live with some buzzing. But of course, we want to get rid of or avoid as much buzzing as possible. And so maybe we should have started this saying that sometimes you can play guitar without fretting and then you hear buzzing. And that's definitely a sign of the action's too low, or it's not action related at all and something else is happening. And that's where we get into things that may not be actual buzzing as so much as a rattle from other things. We'll get into that in a little bit. But one of the things I wanted to mention, we were talking about nuts and saddles. I've run into times with guitars, particularly older guitars, where I'll hear a buzz, and I now remember the first thing I do is I lower, if it's only one string, I would lower the string all the way down, tension, take the bridge pin out and reseat it, because sometimes it's simply the bridge pin and the ball end of the string got a little wonky, and that's actually where the buzz is coming from. And I remember a very long time with a buzz and not knowing why it was happening. And when I learned that, then I mentioned that to a guitar tech guy here years and years ago, and he said one of the things that you can do to prevent buzzing when you're only getting buzzing from one string, no matter the cause, is you can take those little ball ends that you have on strings. If you have the kind of brands of strings that there's actually a hole in it, so it's just a little circle, you can take those and put one or two and actually thread them down your string all the way down to the ball end of the string, and that gives you kind of a little post. So when you put the bridge, I don't know if I'm describing this correctly, but basically you put that, and I had my very first guitar I ever had, all of my strings, I would have to take those ball ends and I would thread them down to the bottom of the string and then put the pins in, and it made a huge difference in getting rid of buzzing. And I'm not sure exactly why, but do you have any thoughts of why, the physics involved of why that would help strings not buzz?
I was hoping you wouldn't ask that. I don't, but I know exactly what you mean, and I know it does work sometimes. I've actually done that, and this is going back long before I had the store. But yeah, you just take a string that you threw away, and like you said, thread it down, let it slide all the way down to the bottom. So now you have an extra one that actually gets butted up against the bridge plate. Why it works, I'm now that you say that on the air, I'm surprised I never wanted to know and ask somebody who could tell me. I don't know that answer, but it's fascinating, and it's not hooey because I've seen it work.
Yes, and it definitely worked. My first guitar was a Conn, Conn, and since they make brass band instruments, obviously they didn't make the guitar. It was from Japan or South Korea, probably. This is in the 1970s, and just had the Conn label on it. But basically, it was a copy of a 00018. And as I got older, that happened, and those ball ends of the string trick really worked for that guitar. Of course, in those days, I was playing tens with super low action because I was basically rocking out and wanted those really bendy strings. But yeah, so as you guys can see already, now that we're, about a half hour in or beyond, that buzzing can be caused by a variety of things. It's not always the same thing. And so it's important when you're trying to tell somebody about the buzzing of your guitar that you try to be as specific as you can and describe your symptoms. When does it buzz? Does it buzz at every fret? Does it only buzz at this fret? Does it, if you put a capo on it, does the buzzing go away? And if so, where, at what fret, how high up do you have to go? Does it only buzz when you put a capo on? And that's one thing that can cause buzzing too. If your capo's not tight enough, that can cause buzzing, or it's not sitting, as well as it should on the strings. All that stuff can cause buzzing. But if the capo is setting correctly and you're getting buzzing, then again, we're talking about action. We're talking about, for some reason, the strings or a string is contacting the frets. And it's important to know when it happens, so the person that's going to try to fix that for you, make sure they're addressing the correct problem. Speaking of frets, what about frets that aren't seated properly, or what other things can about the frets other than divots that might lead to buzzing?
Possibly a tall fret, and this isn't something that's very common, but if a fret becomes loose, it's not going to be seated all the way, and you can the tang and the groove of a fret that lets the fret basically seat into the fretboard slot. It doesn't matter how we get here for this explanation, but if there's a tall fret somewhere, and you say the fourth fret is tall, when you depress something on the third fret, the fourth fret's in the way. So you probably notice if you play on the fifth fret and higher, there's no problem. And then when you play something on frets 1, 2, or 3, it's allowing the vibrating string to meet the fourth fret. So looking for a high fret, I used to see on some YouTube videos or some articles on the internet, you can get a tool from a place like Stuart McDonald that lets you slide this, looks like a little part of a ruler maybe, all the way down your frets. And if you bump into one, I'm careful to say this, it's not always true, but in some cases, if you do this, if you slide this little tool from fret 20 down to, 19, 18, 17, and you bump into the ninth fret might be tall and not seated properly, and this little part of the program has a gigantic maybe not asterisk on it because it's not to diagnose a problem long distance, but that's how you would find that kind of thing out.
There was a band that I would play in New York City called the Tall Frets, I remember.
Really?
And this program, I'm a big fan of accidentally finding names in daily conversation, like pretend people's names. And I think Fret Buzz would have been a great name back in the punk era when people were inventing their own names. Fret Buzz.
Or Fred Buzz.
Fred Buzz. Well, Fred Buzz can be interpreted multiple ways. Fret Buzz, you clearly know what you're talking about. So everything we've talked about right now has been on the front of the guitar. We talked about the strings and the frets and the nut and the saddle and the bridge pins, in fact. And I imagine if you have truly loose frets, that a fret itself may vibrate and cause some kind of weird buzz. You never know. But what about turning the guitar over? Is there anything about the neck, shape of the neck, the way the neck is aligned? I mean, those kind of things, could that possibly cause buzzing when people play?
Well, if we're going to get really technical, would you mind if I take the liberty to stop talking about buzzing and start talking about the evil cousin, the rattle?
Yes. Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Because that's what I think now too. And all we talked about so far are things where somebody comes and says, my guitar's got a buzz. It's making a buzzing sound. And everything we talked up to this point was what I would certainly consider by definition something buzzing, where it's buzzing against a fret. And even though it's the ball into the string was another piece of what you brought up, there is a buzz that happens when the vibration of the string comes into contact with metal. And I'll categorize them as buzzes, but there are also rattles on the guitar that might mistakenly seem like they're buzzing. And if we're just, really splitting hairs, I don't mean to find anybody who wants to call it a buzz, but it's a rattle. That's not important. But what you might be complaining about might be better defined as something's rattling inside the guitar. And when you say turn the guitar over or take a look at the neck, from what I know, and that's not everything, the seating of the neck or the actual attachment where the neck's in the dovetail pocket, I don't think that's going to make buzzing and rattling. But when you think about the truss rod that's inside the guitar's neck, that certainly could be a culprit for, some might call it a buzz, I'd call it a rattle. There's a sympathetic vibration that could happen, especially lately. And I'll go on further to say, especially in the modern deluxe guitars, the really lightweight truss rod that's inside the modern deluxe guitars, all Martin guitars since 2006-ish, have a two-way truss rod where you can actually loosen the truss rod from the center position or tighten it from the center position so it goes from the neutral place, it goes tight and loose. If for some reason that's just in the in-between window where, say, 7 o'clock is completely loose, and if you turn it to 5 o'clock it's completely tight, when it's at noon, it might be relaxed and there's very little or no tension on it. It's not uncommon for us to have a modern deluxe guitar that sounds perfect. I'll play it for a few minutes and check all the frets, put it down, pick it back up again. Now I'm playing the same guitar again the same way, and certain chords make a little bit of a buzz or a rattle. The actual seating of the inside truss rod could be to blame, and 99% of the time, just turning the truss rod just a little bit to get it from wherever it was seated before to turn it from 12 o'clock to 12:30 or from 12 o'clock to 11:30, just giving it a little turn in either direction before it's even really making a difference with your guitar's relief, that could be a culprit as well, but I would call that more a rattle than a buzz if you're asking me for the definition.
Assuming that some of the people listening to this don't really understand the truss rod, other than it's a rod that's put in the neck to help keep the neck from warping. So just quickly say, what's the actual purpose of a truss rod and why do you adjust it? Why is it adjustable at all?
Well, it's adjustable because you want to be able to modify the amount of relief in the neck, and the amount of relief, the word relief is basically space. So if you have a straight edge across the top of the neck from the 1st fret to the 14th fret, or much more conveniently use the string as a straight edge, hold your finger on the 1st fret on the G string, for example, and on that same string, also hold it down at fret 14. Now your G string is acting like a straight edge ruler. You want to look to see how much space is still remaining between the top of the 7th fret and that string when it's depressed at frets 1 and 14. That's defined as relief. And the truss rod, with a truss rod tool or a truss rod wrench, can be loosened or tightened to either add relief or subtract relief. Over time, you can just picture how much stress is on the guitar neck when you have all those 6 strings pulling it away from itself, connected back to the bridge. The strings are constantly pulling with a lot of stress and tension, and the truss rod is in there to help the solid neck stay in place, because over time, if you would tune your guitar, don't do this, but if you would, as an example, in a complete hypothetical situation, tune your guitar instead of where it's at now in standard tuning, tune it up 5 full steps, and it just wants to pull the headstock right off the end of the guitar. You'd basically believe in wouldn't take that long for that neck's going to start bending, and that's just something I should never have recorded on a microphone, but you get what I'm trying to say. The truss rod allows you to counteract that because every day the guitar's sitting in its case tuned to pitch, it's trying to pull itself apart, and the truss rod helps alleviate that.
So in other words, you're adjusting the relief, and that sometimes across the life of the guitar, the relief needs to be adjusted. with a modern two-way adjustable truss rod. That rod can, if you put it at certain positions and play the guitar hard or whatever, that might put out an audible sound that you're calling a rattle.
Yep.
And so for people who have their own truss rod wrenches, how do you alleviate that rattle? Do you just adjust it, just try to adjust it a tiny bit one way or the other, or how would you do it?
Yeah, the tiniest bit. And if turning it a tiny bit doesn't make a difference, turning it a lot is not going to either. And you'll likely introduce problems if the truss rod's already where it belongs. I just mean like going to a clock face and turn it from 12 to just 12 in 1 minute. It's just give it a little bit of a nudge. But that's the only thing inside the neck that could be guilty of making something buzz or rattle. And we haven't talked about what's at the end of the neck yet. How often, Spoon, have you come across someone's guitar, whether it's your own or someone else's, where there's something coming from the top? All those 6 tuners are there. What do you know as far as what's your experience hearing from rattles and buzzes from the headstock and the tuners?
Well, I've definitely experienced rattly tuners, particularly on older guitars, that they rattle, they vibrate, and that gives off a sound. And for people who are trying to get pure tone, that can be really annoying. But so too can the string ends can be touching something. If you don't a lot of people don't clip their string ends really, really short, and the guys that like to roll them up. And I never quite understood the appeal of rolling them up like that. But, those can be those can start vibrating and touching, again, metal on metal and start making some sort of sound. So that's something, to make sure that the housings, if you have closed tuners, to make sure that those screws haven't loosened up, because that can cause rattling. And what else? Is that the kind of stuff you're talking about?
Oh yeah, for sure. And I've heard a lot of people complain about different brands of tuners and different brands of tuners at certain parts of their lifetime, where maybe, for example, Shaler was making a tuner from 2012 to 2018, and then they redesigned it. But some of them have bushings or little washers where you could be as careful as you want to be, but there's one that's going to just want to work its way loose. And again, much like the tension of the strings is actually pulling the headstock forward, and you have to look at the relief in the neck over the years. Every time you play a chord or a note or strum your guitar in any capacity, you're begging the tuner to vibrate along with the string that it's attached to. So there's always the opportunity for something there to make noises. It's not that often that it's really easy to find out, and there are times you might be playing a chord, for example, and hear something that sounds like it's coming from the B tuner, and you look and look and look, and you find that it's the A. Or like me, you find out it's not there, it's the pickup. And we didn't talk about that yet, but it's such a game of like mirrors. You might be completely positive you've narrowed down the part of the guitar that's making the noise, and it's the exact opposite end of the guitar. How many times I've heard people complain about their tuners rattling, and it's actually the jack at the end pin. I mean, the furthest thing from the tuners is what's causing the sound, but you might play guitar in front of me, and we both think, you know what? I'd bet my paycheck that's coming from the E tuner or the A tuner, and it's not even that part of the guitar. The noises can travel in the weirdest ways, so please keep an open mind when you do think you found a problem and you want to tell your luthier, your tech, or the manufacturer. Don't be surprised if you become surprised, I think is what I mean to say.
Well, in that same ballpark of things that can rattle that you don't realize, the braces can come loose, particularly old guitars, guitars that have gone through a lot of severe weather and humidity changes, been dropped. Like if you're dealing with used guitars or guitars that you weren't the original owner, a guitar could have been dropped, and something like that could make a brace come loose just enough that it creates a rattle. And up until this program, I would have called that a buzz. But since we're staying with the definition of buzz being string on metal, then a rattle. And that can happen too, which is unfortunate because that then requires surgery Though there are certainly good guys like John Hall and stuff that can sometimes get in and take care of a loose joint without having to take the top off, for example, which requires refinishing and all that stuff. But many reasons indeed. And we mentioned, technique stuff like that. Sometimes just playing hard. There's some of us heavy-handed people could make any guitar buzz if we really worked at it. So when it comes to string buzz. But there is something else I wanted to bring up, and that is not rattling from something being loose inside the guitar. It's not string buzz where the string is contacting a fret. It's actually distortion. And this is something that can happen when you overdrive a guitar. And sometimes overdrive is a great thing to do, to really dig in and strum as hard as you can. But sometimes guitars will overdrive sooner than you think they are. And it's basically an audible distortion. Oftentimes, it's much more noticeable to the guitarist than the person out front of the guitar that's hearing it being played. And from my experience, the softer the spruce, the more possible that's going to happen. I think Sitka spruce tops are easier to overload in terms of power and overdrive the top than Adirondack spruce. And I'm not sure, really. I don't play enough European spruce guitars and Engelmann guitars. I'm pretty sure Engelmann's even probably softer than Sitka in that respect. So they can sound really beautiful when you play them right in the zone. You go over the zone, and then you get distortion just like you would get out of an amplifier, because that sound chamber of your guitar basically is an amplifier, and the head of the drum is the spruce top. And you introduce scallop bracing, light quarter-inch Sitka scallop bracing. You introduce forward shifted even, depending on the guitar. But for me, short scale Martins with Sitka tops tend to overdrive more easily. And you get a nice growling, gnarly sound, but I think that translates in some people's head as buzz. And because I've heard people say, can't you hear that buzz? And I'm like, no, I don't hear a buzz. I don't hear a buzz at all. But what I do hear is that the tone has lost that violin purity sort of thing and has become growly or raspy. And that's just going to happen. And one of the best cures for that, for an owner of a 0028 like William C. or somebody like that, if they're a hard player, is to use medium strings. They're harder to bend, but you can play them harder. And not only does medium strings, I'm pretty sure if you put on medium strings that your action's going to come up a little bit. That might help with buzzing, but I think it also helps with that distortion sound that I'm talking about. And again, it's a phenomenon that I hear. Other people may not hear it the same way. Other people may describe it an entirely different thing, just like a lot of personal preference stuff, that it's maybe something that somebody loves to hear and that other people find annoying. So I would say if that's what you think you're suffering from, try going to medium strings and just see if that works for you. So we talked about low action. We've talked about frets being uneven, loose, too tall, being worn down in certain places, so you get the divots here and there. And a lot of that stuff can be corrected by technique, by remembering that when I play this string at that fret, it has that sitar buzz. So you get in the habit of playing it lighter until you can afford to the time or the money to have your frets addressed and dressed. Playing too hard, fretting too hard, fretting incorrectly. I notice I get a lot of buzz out of certain guitars when I thumb fret if I press too hard. If I'm playing emotionally and I wrap that thumb around when you're making the D shape and you wrap that around on the bass E string, I have to remember that it doesn't require a vice grip, and the buzzing will just go away if I just remember not to play it as hard. So there's so many different things. Can you think of anything that we've forgotten that when you go down your checklist of buzzing that we might want to mention?
Actually, I can. You just almost started to address it right there. Technique is the one thing we didn't talk about, and it's very unique to each person. So if we both have D28s, mine doesn't buzz, but yours does, and we take a look at them and they're all measured the same way, how you're playing the guitar, how carefully you're playing. You made a comment about, gripping it too tightly. Same could be said for the opposite. If you're not gripping tight enough, there could be certain situations. There's a song I was learning last week for Martin versus Martin with our friend Marshall, and I didn't play it because one of the chords is really hard to play. My first thought wasn't, this guitar buzzes. My first thought was, I can't play that chord correctly. So if you want to be open-minded and honest with yourself, if your guitar only buzzes on those chords that you're not good at, it might not be the guitar. It might be you. And I say that to myself and to you guys and to Spoon. We're all guilty of sometimes not fretting correctly or being confident in the way we're playing our guitars. Our hands are equally as guilty at times as well. So besides technique, which maybe wasn't deserving of being talked about because that's almost obvious, I think everything was really covered except for one embarrassing story that I wasn't sure I was going to share, but maybe there's time for it. If you'd let me, if you would indulge me, let me ask you if you remember me complaining about my guitar buzzing at a NAS Fest, I want to say maybe 10 years ago.
Well, I would just like to say that you never need to ask, Maury, if you want to embarrass yourself on the air in my presence, just fire away.
Yeah, it's an open invitation, isn't it? All right, so the year is circa 2012, 2013, and it doesn't matter if I'm wrong about that, but I was doing a pickup installation on my own guitar, and I remember it vividly. It was the LR Baggs Element, and that specific pickup, that specific installation wants you to drill a hole at a 45-degree angle into the saddle slot, and that you're going to be able to fish the undersaddle braided element up through there. In doing so, I remember putting my drill bit in the guitar. I'm drilling away at my guitar to my heart's content, and the bit broke. And only a little bit of it broke off, but I had this little 3/32 drill bit, and I pulled I pulled the drill out, and a little bit of it didn't come with it. So I, turned the guitar upside down and tapped, and I thought, and this is where the part of the story you have to listen to, I thought I saw it fall out. So I'm playing my guitar for weeks and months and probably more than a year after that incident, and not regularly, not consistently, but every once in a while, I'd be playing certain chords, certain sympathetic vibrations, and I would hear this rattle, and I've been looking at all 6 tuners. I'm looking at all the frets. I'm looking at the end jack with the guitar. I'm pounding my fist on the guitar. Part of the reason to see if I can get that rattle to happen. Part of the reason because I want to smash this guitar in pieces. I'm so mad I can't solve this. I'm passing my guitar around to friends at Martin Fest at 3:30 in the morning in the hallway. You play it. See if it happens for you. I think I hear it, but I'm not sure. And I don't remember who attempted it in what order, but I let 3 or 4 luthiers take a look at it at different times. And Brothers Music, our friends over in Wind Gap, finally found out that some of that little drill bit never made it out of the guitar, and it was actually lodged inside the saddle slot. You can't see it, but picture maybe a 32nd of an inch piece of metal just is sitting in this little pocket hole, and whenever it wants to dance, it's going to make this sound. But that's the most embarrassing, most infuriating rattle my guitar ever had because I basically caused it.
Well, yes, and I'm sure you felt good when that was finally removed, and rightfully felt foolish that it had not fallen out at all. But yes, and that's a coda for this discussion. You mentioned pickups. I have had problems with rattling in the past where it was the wiring from a undersaddle pickup, and and it was just you'd look in there and it would look normal and wouldn't be there. But of course, then when you're in playing position, sure enough, a wire was like hanging down and contacting the treble side of the top or whatever, and would rattle. And it took me a long time to figure that out too, because I suspected that's what it was. But every time I would, try to prove it visually with a mirror or just looking in with a flashlight or whatever, I could never catch it in the act. And I just eventually just went in there and sort of tightened up those wires through their little clasps that were holding them in place, and ultimately that did make it go away. So I have had my own version of, I know it's there, but I can never find it, and finally made it go away. So thanks again to William C. for this very interesting topic, and I hope that didn't leave you even more confused as to why your guitar buzzes, but I hope it's given you at least a roadmap of different things to look into and try to figure out wherefore and how come, which I guess are actually mean the same thing, your guitar buzzes.
Well, that's great. Thank you very much again, William. We're glad you reached out. It's always nice to hear from friends. And that brings me to a very important buzz point for this episode. We'd love it if you could share this episode with a friend. And even better still, if you've enjoyed this podcast, please consider leaving us a review on Apple Podcasts. We might even read your review on the air. BC writes, I enjoyed the podcast, particularly in reveling in your vast experience and subsequent knowledge of guitars, especially Martins. I find the subtleties that those who are really immersed in certain subjects or items debate are often barely on the horizon for the rest of us, though most people tend not to admit it. Thank you so much, BC.
Well, that was just great. Thank you, BC. I appreciate that very much. And I look forward to having you add further comments in the future.
I couldn't have said it better myself. From all of us at Maury's Music, thanks for listening.
Hear you later.
This has been a presentation of Maury's Music, your trusted source for Martin and Blue Ridge guitars. Find us online at maurysmusic.com.